What if the real tragedy of my life wasn't the mistakes I made, but the years I wasted believing I had more time to fix them? I'm 62 years old, and no one ever warned me that the hardest lessons don't break you when they happen. They sit quietly inside you for decades and wait until the house is empty, until the phone stops ringing, until the mirror shows you a man with silver in his beard and lines around his eyes that weren't there before. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, everything else would take care of itself. I measured my worth in paychecks, in square footage, in the horsepower of the truck parked in my driveway. 70-hour workweeks felt like honor badges. I told myself I was doing it for my family, for security, for a future where we wouldn't have to worry about anything. What I didn't understand was that while I was building a business, life was happening in rooms I wasn't in. My daughter turned 8 while I was on a conference call in a hotel room 2 states away. My wife learned to stop asking if I'd be home for dinner. My son stopped waiting up. I told myself they understood. I told myself there would be time later to slow down, to reconnect, to show up properly. No one warned me that later is a gamble, and time doesn't negotiate. The promotions came. The bank account grew. We upgraded from 1,800 square feet to 3,200. I stood in the driveway the day we moved in, feeling like I had finally proven something. But I can't remember a single ordinary Tuesday from those years. I can't remember what my kids were excited about, or what they were afraid of. I remember contracts. I remember numbers. I remember stress. I thought providing was the same as being present. It isn't. Providing fills closets. Presence fills memories. When my marriage began to thin out like old fabric, I blamed stress. I blamed the economy. I blamed anything except my own absence. It wasn't some dramatic explosion that changed everything. It was quiet distance. Separate routines. Polite conversations. 2 people living under the same roof, but no longer sharing a life. By the time I realized something was wrong, we had already grown into strangers who knew each other's schedules but not each other's hearts. No one warns you that neglect is rarely loud. It's subtle. It's choosing one more meeting over one more dinner at home. It's saying next weekend, enough times that next weekend stops coming. I used to think strength meant pushing through exhaustion, ignoring the tightness in my chest, skipping doctor appointments because there was too much to do. Now I understand that strength would have been admitting I was tired. Strength would have been saying no. At 62, I wake up earlier than I need to. Not because of ambition, but because sleep doesn't come as easily anymore. The house is quiet in a way that echoes. My children have their own lives now. They are polite. They call on holidays. But there is a distance that wasn't there when they were small, and I can't help but wonder if I built that distance brick by brick with every late night at the office. The cruelest part isn't that I failed. It's that I didn't even realize what I was losing while I was losing it. I thought I had decades to repair small fractures. I thought love would simply wait for me to have more free time. I thought youth was renewable. It isn't. If you're listening to this and you still believe you have plenty of time to become the husband, the father, the friend you mean to be someday, ask yourself one question I never asked soon enough. What if someday arrives, and the people you meant to show up for have already learned to live without you? I used to believe that if I could just reach one more milestone, I would finally feel secure. One more contract. One more year of record profits. One more investment that proved I was still sharp. What no one explained to me is that ambition does not come with an off switch. It keeps asking for more, even after you have already given it your youth. In my 40s, I told myself that exhaustion was temporary. I drank coffee like it was fuel and wore stress like it was a badge of honor. I ignored the quiet evenings when my wife would sit across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while I answered emails. We were only 10 feet apart, yet miles away. I thought proximity meant connection. It does not. I convinced myself that love was durable, that it could survive neglect as long as the bills were paid and the lawn was trimmed every Saturday. I did not realize that love requires attention the way a garden requires water. Skip a few days, and nothing changes. Skip a few seasons, and everything does. When the divorce papers were finally signed, there was no shouting, no dramatic collapse. Just signatures on clean white paper and a quiet understanding that we had drifted too far to swim back. I remember driving home afterward in my 3-year-old sedan, the leather seats still smelling new, and realizing I had no one waiting for me. The house was large, the rooms echoing. 3,200 square feet can feel very small when it is empty. I had spent decades chasing financial stability, yet I had never asked myself what emotional stability required. I assumed resilience meant handling everything alone. I see now that isolation is not strength. It is a slow surrender. Around that time, I began to notice how few real conversations I had. Most of my relationships were transactional. We talked about markets, about forecasts, about returns. We did not talk about fear, regret, or loneliness. I did not know how. I had built an identity around being reliable, composed, productive. There was no space in that identity for vulnerability. And so I carried my disappointments quietly, telling myself this was what adulthood looked like. It took me years to understand that adulthood without reflection turns into repetition. You wake up, you work, you pay, you sleep, you repeat. The calendar pages fall away, and one day you look up and realize you have been busy, but not necessarily alive. If I could speak to the man I was at 45, I would not tell him to work less. I would tell him to measure success differently. Not in revenue, not in square footage, not in titles. I would tell him to count the number of dinners shared without a phone on the table, the number of honest conversations had before midnight, the number of times he chose presence over pride. Because in the end, the numbers that matter are not printed on statements. They are stored in memory. And memory does not care how much you earned. It only remembers whether you were there. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into your life when your children no longer need you the way they once did. It does not arrive all at once. It grows slowly, almost politely. First it is fewer phone calls. Then it is shorter visits. Then it is conversations that stay on the surface, safe and efficient. I used to believe that once my children became independent, it would feel like success. I raised them well. They could stand on their own. That was the goal. But no one told me that independence, when built without emotional closeness, can quietly turn into distance. When my son bought his first house, I felt proud. He handled everything on his own. He did not ask for advice. At the time, I told myself that meant I had done my job. Now I sometimes wonder if he simply learned that I was too busy to ask. My daughter calls on Sundays. We talk about work, about the weather in her state, about practical things. I listen to her voice and try to remember the little girl who used to run into my arms when I came home. I remember promising myself I would always be her safe place. Somewhere along the way, I became more of a background figure than a refuge. I taught my children about discipline, about achievement, about responsibility. I made sure they respected deadlines and understood the value of $1. What I did not teach them well enough was how to talk about fear, or disappointment, or doubt. I did not model it. I kept my own struggles hidden behind a calm exterior. I thought I was protecting them. In reality, I may have been teaching them that emotions should be handled alone. When my father passed away years ago, I told myself I would not repeat his mistakes. He was distant, always focused on work. I swore I would be more present. Yet in many ways, I followed the same blueprint. It is uncomfortable to admit that patterns repeat unless someone is brave enough to break them. I was not as brave as I believed. Now, when I sit at the kitchen table with my morning coffee, I think about the small moments I dismissed. School plays I arrived late to. Weekend trips I postponed. Simple conversations cut short because I had emails to answer. Each decision felt minor. At the time, together, they shaped the story of our relationship. Children do not measure love in grand gestures. They measure it in attention, in eye contact, in whether you put your phone down when they speak. I used to think respect came automatically with age. I understand now that respect grows from connection, and connection requires time that cannot be scheduled between meetings. I do not blame my children for building lives that do not revolve around me. That is natural. What I question is whether I gave them enough reasons to come back, not out of obligation, but out of desire. The hardest lesson is realizing that love is not sustained by sacrifice alone. It is sustained by presence. And presence is something I offered too sparingly when it mattered most. There was a time when I believed that the number of contacts in my phone meant something. I could scroll for nearly a full minute without reaching the end. Clients, partners, acquaintances from conferences in Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. My calendar used to be full weeks in advance. Lunch meetings, networking events, charity dinners where everyone shook hands firmly and promised to stay in touch. I mistook visibility for connection. I thought being known was the same as being valued. When business was strong, invitations arrived effortlessly. People wanted my opinion. They wanted access. They wanted to be near momentum. I did not question it. It felt normal. It felt earned. Then the market shifted. A few investments underperformed. A contract I had counted on fell through. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual tightening. I had to scale back, let go of expansion plans, say no to projects that once would have been automatic yes answers. That was when I began to notice the silence. Fewer calls, fewer invitations. Messages left unanswered a little longer each time. At first I assumed everyone was busy. I gave them the same benefit of the doubt I once gave myself when I did not return calls quickly. But weeks turned into months, and I understood something uncomfortable. Many of my relationships were tied to my usefulness. When I was a resource, I was surrounded. When I became less advantageous, I became less visible. It is not that anyone was cruel. No one said it out loud. That is what makes the lesson harder. It revealed itself quietly. I started having dinner alone more often, sitting at the same wooden table where I once reviewed contracts late into the night. The house that used to feel too small for my ambitions now felt too large for my life. I realized I had invested years into building a reputation, but very little into building true friendship. I had colleagues. I had partners. I had people who respected my work. But I could count on one hand the people who knew what kept me awake at night. And even those few had grown distant because I rarely let them see past the surface. Pride played a role. I did not want to admit when things were uncertain. I did not want to appear less capable than the image I had carefully maintained. So I withdrew instead of reaching out. I told myself I was handling it. I see now that isolation often disguises itself as independence. I had confused the two for most of my adult life. A real friend does not measure your value by your quarterly performance. A real friend stays when there is nothing to gain. I wish I had understood earlier that loyalty is revealed in quiet seasons, not in crowded rooms. If you want lasting connection, you have to risk being known beyond your achievements. You have to allow someone to see you without the title, without the success, without the carefully polished confidence. That was a risk I avoided for too long, and the cost of that avoidance was not immediate. It accumulated slowly, until one day I looked around and realized that being respected is not the same as being accompanied. The older I get, the more I understand that time is not something you manage, it is something you spend, and once it is gone there is no refund, no extension, no negotiation. In my 30s and 40s, I treated time like a renewable resource. I assumed that as long as I stayed healthy and productive, there would always be another year to repair what I postponed. I said I would take the trip next summer. I said I would visit my parents when work slowed down. I said I would focus on my health once the business stabilized. There was always a condition attached to living fully. What I did not see was that life rarely stabilizes in the way you expect. There is always another project, another obligation, another reason to delay what truly matters. When my mother passed away, I found myself standing in a quiet room filled with old photographs. In those pictures, she looked younger than I remembered, her smile patient, her posture steady. I tried to recall the last unhurried conversation we had, one without glancing at my watch or thinking about the drive back. I struggled to find it. That realization stayed with me longer than any financial setback ever did. Success can be rebuilt. Time with someone who is gone cannot. Around the same period, my doctor told me my blood pressure was higher than it should be. Nothing catastrophic, just a warning. I nodded politely and promised to exercise more. I bought running shoes that sat in the closet for months. I had spent decades pushing my body as if it were a machine designed to absorb stress without consequence. Now I feel the stiffness in my knees when I stand up. I feel the fatigue settle in earlier in the evening. The body keeps score even when the calendar moves quietly. I used to believe that aging was something that happened gradually, almost invisibly. The truth is that one day you wake up and realize you have fewer years ahead than behind. That realization changes the weight of every decision. I no longer measure my days by productivity alone. I measure them by attention. Did I notice the sunlight coming through the kitchen window? Did I call my son just to ask how he is doing without offering advice? Did I sit long enough with my own thoughts to understand what I am feeling instead of distracting myself? Time does not announce its value when you are young. It feels abundant, almost infinite. Only later do you understand that it was the most limited resource you ever had. If there is one lesson that stands above the rest, it is this: do not wait for the perfect season to live differently. There is no perfect season. There is only the present hour, the conversation in front of you, the person within reach. Everything else is an assumption. And assumptions are expensive.